Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome, everybody. I'm delighted to see so many curious minds, eager to hear RAE Langton speak about reimagining free speech. I'm one of these minds, eager to hear the lecture. My name is Neumeier, and I have the privilege of co-organizing this lecture together with my colleague Romy, Jaster. The lecture is part of a 3-day colloquium on free speech and freedom of opinion. Romy and I, we are very grateful to the Wissenschaftskolleg and the BBAW, and of course to Humboldt-Universität for making the colloquium and this evening possible. We're particularly honored that RAE Langton has agreed to come to Berlin and share with us her ideas on how we should think about free speech in the future, and why we perhaps should think about it a little bit differently than we perhaps have done for a long time. I would just like to briefly introduce our distinguished speaker, our equally distinguished panelist, Christoph Möllers, and our equally distinguished moderator, Romy, Jaster. RAE Langton is Knightbridge Professor of Philosophy at the University of Cambridge. She's chair of the Philosophy faculty and fellow of Newnham College, which has played an important part in the education of women at Cambridge. She holds a PhD from Princeton and is fellow of the British Academy and the American Academy of Arts and Science. She's the author of Kantian Humility, Our Ignorance of Things in Themselves, published by OUP in 2001. Closer to our topic today, she's the author of a number of, and I think it's not an exaggeration to say world-famous, articles on free speech, most notably Speech Acts and Unspeakable Acts, which use the theory of Speech Act to think about normative issues of free speech. She also gave a TED talk on free speech, so count her in the rockstar league of philosophers. A constant theme of her work on free speech has been to remind us of the many things, good and terrible, we can do with our words, and that we should not think about freedom of speech without at the same time asking the question, who might be silenced by our speech? RAE Langton has not only many interesting thoughts to offer, but also a very interesting website, which not only lists her publications and many, many achievements, which is common, but also some, and I quote, career lowlights. And I will take the liberty and read a bit from this section of her homepage, because I also think it sheds an important light on her story and what it means to become and to be a philosopher. My birth certificate doesn't have my name on it, she writes, nor my mother's, though it helpfully includes my father's and my grandfather's. A great future was prophesied for me at the age of 16, namely that I would marry a mighty servant of the Lord. She goes on to tell us that her application to study English at Oxford was unsuccessful, though the fellow liked the sound, intelligent way I wrote. And I might add that she was later invited to Oxford to give the John Locke lecture in 2015. At Princeton, her PhD dissertation was initially rejected, though somewhat awkwardly, OUP had meanwhile decided to publish it as Kantian Humility, and as one of the reviewer notes, one of the most original and thought-provoking books on Kant to have appeared for a very long time. I think what this shows is that RAE Langton is not only a very bright mind and a witty mind, but also a very mindful person. We're equally happy to have Christoph Möllers here to comment on her lecture. He's professor of constitutional law and jurisprudence here at Humboldt Law Faculty and a permanent fellow of the Wissenschaftskolleg. He was awarded the Leibniz-Preis, the most important academic award there is in Germany. But more importantly, maybe he's the author of many groundbreaking books on constitutional law, political theory, and political philosophy. I will only mention the 3 branches: a comparative model of separation of powers, published by OUP in 2013, the possibility of norms, a wide-ranging endeavor to conceptualize what norms, be it legal, moral, or social, actually are, published by OUP in 2020, and most recently, not yet translated, I think, Freiheitsgrade, Elemente einer liberalen politischen Mechanik, a highly thoughtful and thought-provoking book on liberalism. Discussion will be moderated by Romy, Jaster, who's a lecturer here at Humboldt Philosophy Department. She works on practical epistemology, philosophy of language, disinformation and conspiracy theories, theoretically, not practically. She's the author of 2 books, Die Wahrheit schafft sich ab, Wie Fake News Politik machen, together with David Lanius, Reclam 2019, and a widely acclaimed book on agents' abilities, De Gruyter 2020, which won her the Steegmuller Prize of the German Society of Analytical Philosophy. She's particularly interested in norms of public debate and co-founder of the Forum for Streitkultur and many other initiatives to make philosophy more publicly accessible. Now I think we have three very able agents on the stage tonight, so let us hear what they can do with their words. RAE Langton will speak for about 45 minutes, followed by a conversation with Christoph Möllers, before we then open up the discussion to the audience. And I was asked to add that this event will be live streamed and recorded, and if you have any concerns about data protection or whatever, you might sit at the back of the room and you will not be recorded and you will not be visible. Having said that, Ray, welcome again. I think we're all very excited to hear your lecture.
Thank you so much for that extremely flattering and partly true and partly false introduction. It's a tremendous honor to be here, and I'm also looking forward to hearing what you all have to say in the discussion, because this is very much work in progress. So today, I'm going to start there we go. Today I want to explore a distinctive way of thinking about speech and free speech. And so in slogan form, free speech is about the protection and enablement of speech acts that matter. So far, very vague. I'll explain what I mean in a moment. But for the enablement part of the slogan, I want to draw on HLA Hart. Not perhaps on the ideas for which he's most famous, but on some ideas that leap out to me, which have been somewhat forgotten. I'll begin with a story from a lovely interview I found with Hart, which was done in 1988. Hart confessed in the interview to his initial terror when he was a young man about doing philosophy. He described how he had tremendous cold feet as a young fledgling philosophy don at Oxford back in 1945. And he described how a certain J.L. Austin cured him of his cold feet and introduced him to, quote, some ideas. Here's what he said. I had tremendous cold feet for 2 years. I had to deal with a very large number of returning servicemen. Some of the students were seasoned, age 38 or something. I thought I should never catch up. That was my initial stage fright. Okay, so it seems odd thinking of Hart with stage fright, but maybe not so odd if we've read Nikki Lacey's wonderful biography of Hart, which brings out Hart's vulnerability in Oxford as an outsider on the inside. That's her phrase describing Hart in Oxford, an outsider on the inside. Why? Given his training as a barrister in philosophy and, meanwhile, as a philosopher in law. So he felt an outsider in both, but of course he was ultimately an insider in both and a wonderful exemplar for conversations between law and philosophy. Also, there was his ambiguous sexuality and his Jewish background, which Nikki Lacey discusses both of these things. And so there's the outsider on the inside thought. But I'm not going to go into that. I want to take a look at Hart's cure for cold feet and his physician, namely Austin. So here's what happens next in the interview. The person who got me out of the stage fright was Professor J.L. Austin. He ran a seminar for what he called the hacks, the dons, on Saturday mornings when we discussed a great range of questions. He was a genius at this kind of thing. This steadied my nerves. Sugarman, the interviewer, asked, how influential was Austin on you? Hart replies, very. His understanding and subtle analysis of language was unrivaled, which absolutely excited me. And then he was naturally interested in law. He would have made a formidable QC. We ran a class together and we read cases at each other, and then it became clear to me that he had some ideas. So, what ideas? Austin had, and I'm quoting, the idea of what he called performance utterances, and here the law came into its own. Hart says, when I say, I hereby give you my gold pen, I'm not describing what I'm doing, I'm actually doing it with words. Austin wrote how to do things with words. That tremendously impressed me. I developed that in certain ways. The other thing was his general interest in the diversity of rules and standards of conduct. So Hart was inspired by Austin's ideas, and I'm just going to pluck two out. The idea of speech as doing things with words, and the idea of a diversity of rules. Some rules direct us. They tell us to do things or not to do things, order us not to steal or not to heckle. Other rules, and this is his great insight, I think, give us powers and abilities. They empower us or enable us to do things, to vote, to marry, to make a will. I'll go into what he says about that in a moment, but I want to build on those. So, my thought is that we should think of free speech as a freedom to do things with words, which requires both directive and empowering rules. And so this is giving a bit more content to the slogan. The schema that free speech is about the protection and enablement of speech acts that matter, that could conceivably be filled out in various ways. In fact, probably nearly every theory of free speech could be fitted into that schema. But I mean it to be understood as follows. Free speech involves the protection through directive rules that create permissions and obligations, and enablement through empowering rules that create certain capacities of speech acts, doing things with words, that matter given their normative significance. And this is at the top of your handout. Now a brief word about the handout. Like many of my handouts, it begins with a guide to what I'm going to say, taking you on a little path through. It also then has some quotes that I'm going to refer to, and then at the end, a couple of bits of further reading, if you're interested. We can't dodge the question of what matters, and here again I want to draw on a different bit of H.L.A. Hart, namely his response to Rawls. I'll go into that in a moment, but basically it's Hart talking about the costs of liberty, and his instinct that Rawls had not said enough about the costs of liberty and who should bear them and what the state should do in response to those costs. He observed the need for balancing when there are costs. Here he mentions rules of order in a debate, rules which restrict the liberty to speak when we please. They don't protect a greater or more extensive liberty, contrary to Rawls. They rather protect a liberty to do something more valuable. So he's, not dodging the question of what matters. He thinks that we have to answer it. The difference between speech that is heckling and speech that is reasoned debate is not a difference in quantity or extension, contrary to Rawls, but a difference in value. Looking at those ideas in Austin, the idea about what speech is, doing things with words, giving a gold pen, promising, marrying, consenting, voting, arguing, testifying, expressing opinions, about which we've been hearing a lot at our workshop. When you say certain words, your saying is always a kind of doing, and Hart was struck by Austin's discovery here of speech acts. The idea of the diversity of rules. This is developed in Hart's third chapter in the Concept of Law, first of all, in his distinction between rules that direct us and empower us. And so my hunch is going to be that the empowering rules have got something to say about a different way of thinking of free speech and about silence also. How do rules empower us? Not the way a cure for cold feet might empower us. We're considering, in the first instance, a legal or quasi-legal sense of power or empowerment. Rules literally create powers to do things, including powers to do things with words, powers to give someone a gold pen or to marry, and they create these powers by specifying certain procedures and conditions that enable us to create structures of rights and duties and mold our legal relations with each other, says Hart. I'll get back to that more in a moment. moment. So what Hart wanted to emphasize is that these rules do not direct us. These are parts of the law that are not about telling us what to do. They are parts of the law that are about creating a space for our actions. And I think this is a really, really important insight, and I want to apply it to our thoughts about free speech. So we're used to the idea that free speech involves the protection of speech through rules, directive rules, which permit speech and prohibit restrictions and penalties on speech. For example, the First Amendment of the US Constitution. But what if free speech requires empowerment as well as an absence of a ban or penalty? What if empowering rules are needed not just for ceremonial performatives like the Austinian cases of wills and marriages, but for ordinary communicative speech acts, the traditional province of free speech? That's what I'm interested in. A corollary of this picture will be that silence involves failing to do things with words, perhaps because your voice is censored. That's the usual way of thinking of silencing. Censored through a directive rule that says nobody is allowed to speak in such and such a way, or people of such and such a kind are not allowed to speak. Or perhaps because your voice is disempowered through the absence of an empowering rule. So what I'm going to be saying is that the empowering rules also disempower. Well, I'll explain why soon. When that happens, your attempt to speak can be a misfire, as Austin called it. It can be a nullity, as Hart called it, drawing on how that word is used in British law. So I'm interested also in the parallels between legal rules and social rules. Hart and Austin were both interested in that. That came out in the interview. And I've been interested in that elsewhere. You'll see why in a moment. What about that part, the protection and enablement of speech acts that matter? Okay, this is going to raise questions about neutrality. I see that. But I again will be taking my cue from Hart, from his enthusiasm for J.S. Mill, who also had some ideas about speech and the point of free speech, also, as I mentioned, from Hart's critique of rules. So now, let's get on to the diversity of rules. So he introduced two kinds of rules. Rules of the first type impose duties. Rules of the second type confer powers, public or private. Hart emphasized the significance of rules that confer powers. Such rules had been neglected by his predecessors, for whom the law was regarded as a system of directives, orders backed by threats, embodied, for example, in the criminal law. Power-conferring rules do something quite different. They, and now here is my quotation number 3. These are not quite in the right order, sorry, the quotations. Power-conferring rules provide individuals with facilities for realizing their wishes by conferring legal powers on them to create, by certain specified procedures and subject to certain conditions, structures of rights and duties within the coercive framework of the law. The power thus conferred on individuals to mold their legal relations with others by, and here are his examples, by contracts, wills, marriages, etc. So laws on contracts, wills, and marriages are paradigm cases of laws which are not telling you what to do and punishing you telling you what not to do and punishing you if you do it, like criminal law telling you not to steal. They rather are laws which create a space for building certain kinds of social relationships. It's a feature of law which is obscured if we represent law as a matter of orders backed by threats. This is the primary purpose of this chapter of Concept of Law. So there's an Austinian flavor, obviously, to this part of the concept of law, with its contrast between rules as orders backed by threats and rules that confer powers. The latter provide individuals with capacities to create, by certain specified procedures and subject to certain conditions, structures of rights and duties, helping us to mold our relations with each other, enabling certain forms of saying to counter certain forms of doing through speech acts of contract, will-making, and marriage. So we've got the laws that say things like don't steal or else, and we've got the laws that do things like make a space for enabling us to marry or make a will. Some laws, by the way, do both. Australian laws on voting, for example, empower citizens to vote. That empowers you to perform a certain speech act. They also require us to vote. I'm Australian, and when I'm in Australia, I have not only a right but also a duty to vote, and I will get fined if I don't. In support of the distinctiveness of power-conferring rules, he observed that non-compliance results in something quite different for each of the two kinds of rules. When you fail to comply with an empowering rule, that is not disobedience. That's a very key insight. Rather, it is what he calls a nullity. If we do not comply, I'm quoting, with the conditions on a will, it will be a nullity without legal force or effect. It will not be a breach or a violation of any obligation or duty. So failure to comply with a rule about the conditions on a will results in a nullity. It is not a will at all. It's a nullity without legal force or effect. It is what Austin called a misfire. A misfire is a speech act that has failed as a speech act. It has failed as what Austin called an illocutionary act. It's not a violation of a breach. It's not a breach of a duty. So I have a section about the relation of this to other ideas in Hart about secondary rules, but I'm not going to talk about them here. That's an interesting topic, how this introduction to Hart's secondary rules actually is drawing on Austin, and then he goes on to develop it in a rather different way. Now I want to say something about that other part of Hart I mentioned, where he draws on where he responds to rules and criticizes rules for not taking seriously enough the costs of liberty. In his critique of rules, any scheme providing for the general distribution in society of liberty of action not only gives individuals the advantages of that liberty, but also, and this is the quotation number 2 on the handout, exposes them to whatever disadvantages the practices of that liberty by others may entail for them. These disadvantages include not only interference with another individual's basic liberties, but also the various forms of harm, pain, and suffering against which legal systems usually provide by restrictive rules. Such harm may also include the destruction of forms of social life or amenities which otherwise would have been available to the individual. I think that is such an important thought, that such harm may also include the destruction of forms of social life or amenities which otherwise would have been available. So Hart describes conflicts between liberty and other values, and he also describes conflicts within liberty itself. And in both cases, he insists that we have to consider the relative value. We have to ask the question, which matters more? We must. He found Rawls' insistence on the priority of liberty baffling and dogmatic, and he diagnosed its roots in an unacknowledged assumption, a latent ideal of Rawls himself, about liberty and political participation. He thought that Rawls was secretly assuming in his original position that every agent would want what the liberal wants, and they would not willingly, for instance, trade political participation for material security. That is an interesting empirical thought, but basically Hart is anticipating here a form of critique of Rawls that became very important later, including critiques of Rawls as an ideal theorist, feminist critiques of Rawls, which involve the over-readiness of Rawls and many other liberal political philosophers to project their liberal self onto every other citizen and assume that their values were just the same. I'm thinking there of Charles Mills on ideal theory and Susan Oken as a feminist critic of Rawls. Hart draws attention to some familiar considerations of relative value when it comes to certain rules about speech. And that's where he discusses libel and he discusses civil debate. The case of libel presents a conflict between liberty and something else. The case of civil debate presents a conflict within liberty itself. Libel rules shield citizens from the harm, pain, and suffering, to use his phrase, inflicted by speech, restricting a speech liberty for a different value that matters more. What about debate? Rules of order in debate restrict the liberty to, in Hart's phrase, speak when we please. And in this case, they restrict one speech liberty for the sake of another liberty, in fact, another speech liberty. Hart says, and I quoted this before, what such rules of debate help to secure is not a greater or more extensive liberty, contrary to rules, but rather a liberty to do something which is more valuable than the activities forbidden by the rules. Libel and heckling are both speech, but there are directive rules backed by penalties which restrict them both with the aim of protecting something more valuable in each of those cases. And in the second case, with the aim of protecting something more valuable, which is a kind of speech itself. So you're restricting one kind of speech for the sake of another. Hart's attention to the costs of liberty is a prescient warning for some free speech pathologies that many of us have been hearing about in our workshop and that have been occupying many people in recent years. We don't need much reminder that various forms of harm, pain, and suffering can be wrought by speech, and also the destruction of forms of social life or amenities, including damage to the democratic process itself, often done for profit by agents who do not speak as individual citizens, or even, in many cases, as human beings, but as corporations, states, political parties, machines, robots, robot algorithms, and more. So this is not a paper about all of that. But such destruction can be wrought by lies, and let me emphasize, it can be also wrought by bullshit, which I mean, of course, in a very technical sense, because I'm a philosopher. And I mean by bullshit this, and here I'm quoting Harry Frankfurt. Maybe some of you know his book, which is based on a little philosophy essay that was called Bullshit, and then it became a bestseller when he published it as a book called Bullshit. The bullshitter, says Harry Frankfurt, is neither on the side of the true nor on the side of the false. He does not care whether the things he says describe reality correctly. He just picks them out or makes them up to suit his purpose. So a lot of the concern that we hear today, or maybe have today, about post-truth, about fake news, about alternative facts, a lot of it is about lies. A lot of it is also about bullshit in Harry Frankfurt's sense. It's about not caring whether the things you say describe reality correctly, but simply making them up to suit your purpose. It's a good question whether bullshit is expressing a Meinung, but I think I better postpone that for when I can defend myself a bit better. Okay. There's a lot of bullshit around as well as a lot of lies, including with our leaders, some of whom are self-described bullshitters. By self-described, I mean their self-descriptions exactly match Frankfurt's description of a bullshitter. To take the United States, in the time of Trump, some of you might know this little story. Okay, how many things by Trump could I quote? Anyway, but this is going back in time. When Justin Trudeau said at one point that Canada had no trade deficit with the USA, Donald Trump responded, "Wrong, Justin, you do." And then he later bragged, "I didn't even know. I had no idea. I just said you're wrong." So thus spake the demonizer of the fake news media. To take the United Kingdom, this is going back to not long ago, when Boris Johnson described to the BBC his own writing methods as a journalist based in Brussels, back when he was a journalist, he said, "Some of my most joyous hours have been spent in a state of semi-incoherence, composing foam-flecked hymns of hate to the latest Euro infamy." Johnson was referring to his propagation of Euromyths over the decades leading up to Brexit, on such themes as, excuse my language, bonkers bureaucrats banning bendy bananas, one-size-fits-all Euro condoms, snails classified as fish. I draw from the rich scholarly resources of the tabloid press on various Euromyths, not all of which were propagated by Boris Johnson, but this was the kind of thing. What was so sweet was that I later found out that the EU has a whole website debunking every Euromyth, which says something about the problems faced by counter-speech, which I hope to get to in a moment. Okay. Here's Boris Johnson again in the same interview. I was sort of chucking these rocks over the garden wall, and I listened to this amazing crash. This is when he was in Brussels. His missives were chucking rocks over the garden wall. And I listened to this amazing crash from the greenhouse next door over in England. It really gave me this, I suppose, rather weird sense of power. At least he's honest. Not. Sorry. The costs of liberty have been a concern for feminists and critical race theorists in many other streams of thinking, writing, for example, on pornography and hate speech. There's lots to say on this topic. I don't know how much to say about it here. Let me see my time. I think I will skip some of it, but some of it is about how the normalization of pornography has effectively made pornography a form of sex education, which has had major effects on hearers. Hate speech has led to deadly attacks on believers at worship, mass shootings of children in school. It is, the theorists working in these areas do not see these forms of speech as mere expression of opinion. They look hard always at the speech acts done with these kinds of words. And this brings up things that we've been talking about in our workshop. When is it incitement? When is it an expression of an opinion? And here some of Mill's work comes in. We were discussing earlier today Mill's idea that the opinion that the corn dealers are the starvers of the poor can be expressed freely in the newspapers, but you shouldn't shout it or hand it out on pamphlets to an angry mob in front of the house of the corn dealer, arguably because in that latter case it would count as incitement to violence. We're going to think about how then to reimagine speech in the light of this. And we're building on these two ideas. The ideas about saying as doing, the ideas about diversity of rules. So I now want to look at the idea of the empowering rules a little bit more closely. Remember that for Hart, he saw the error of his predecessors as having been to see the law as a system of orders and sanctions only, leaving out its vital role in the creation of powers. To be a speaker at all is to have a certain power to do things with words, and some of these powers need the law, not just for their protection, but for their very being. It is this role which Hart describes as one of the great contributions of law to social life. The creative role of the law, giving us power to mold our relationships through speech acts that create permissions and obligations and build space for doing things we could not otherwise do, following certain specified procedures subject to certain conditions. Austen would have called them felicity conditions. We can perform speech acts that maintain or alter or control the social and normative landscape in which we live. Many of our speech powers do not need the law for their very being. One mentioned by Hart himself is the power to promise. We don't need the law to be able to promise things to each other. It may need a social practice. As some of you know, in ethics this is contested, but I'm going to be assuming it does need a social practice, as Hume thought. But it doesn't per se need the law. But there are many other speech powers besides promising that don't in themselves need the law for their being. And among those are the speech powers we think of when we think of the speech that needs to be protected under the heading of free speech. I have in mind the power to assert things, or the powers to argue, the powers to testify, the powers to tell each other things, the powers to protest or to criticize. These powers are the stuff of communicative speech. So unlike the powers to marry or make a will, they don't need the law, though they might need the law for their protection. What do they need for their very being? They too need norms and practices which are comparable to the law's empowering rules. I want to suggest. Social norms resemble the law in their own diversity of rules. Social norms, just like the law, have different roles. Sometimes they can be directive. Sometimes they can be empowering. Some social norms are like orders backed by threats. Don't put your elbows on the table. That's a rather minimal social norm. You might get into trouble if you do, but not too much trouble. Other social norms create powers, possibilities for actions, and limitations on action. And I mentioned promising as an example of something that might depend on a social practice. So what I'm looking at now is the idea that there are powers to mold our relations with each other that allow ordinary citizens to create structures that bind us in ties of obligation and intimacy with other ordinary citizens. Social norms comparable to the law of the empowering kind. The power to promise, to tell people things, to protest, to criticize, to consent, all of these need background norms. And sometimes we call those norms conventions, and sometimes we call them social practices, and sometimes we call them the powers that they enable, deontic powers. Now I want to reimagine silence. If speech is about doing things with words, silence is about failing to do things with words, and that can happen in two ways, corresponding to Hart's two kinds of rules. Here's one way. You're silenced because your speech is banned or censored. You're punished if you speak. You're silenced by a rule of Hart's first kind, a directive rule, which is like an order backed by threats and sanctions. That's what comes to mind when you think about silencing of speech. But here's another way. You lack the power to speak in Hart's sense of a power. Perhaps something has got in the way of your exercising that power. Your attempt to speak will misfire. It will be a nullity. And when this happens, you've been silenced by a rule of the second kind, the empowering kind. And now I want to get into the idea that an empowering rule, by the same token, also disempowers. Corresponding to Hart's two kinds of rules, there are two kinds of silence. And why is the empowering rule also a source of disempowerment? Well, we need to think about misfires and nullities. Some of you might know that Austin was completely hilarious on the topic of misfires. And I'll get to Austin in a moment. Hart is a bit less colourful. Here's what he says. A nullity ensues when some essential conditions are not fulfilled. Failure to conform to the conditions of the enabling rules make what is said a nullity. And this goes hand in hand with the very idea of an empowering rule. It's important to emphasize that the possibility of being silenced through this disempowerment goes hand in hand with the empowering rule. Here's how Hart puts it, and it's a great analogy. The provision for nullity is part of this type of rule itself. If failure, and now he's got a sporting analogy, which I love because elsewhere in my work I draw on sporting analogies to explain rules of certain kinds. If failure to get the ball between the posts did not mean the nullity of not scoring, the scoring rules could not be said to exist. In other words, the possibility of failing to score a goal and the possibility of scoring a goal are both consequences of the constitutive rules that set up the game of football. The empowering rules create the possibility of failure at the same time they create the possibility of success. Here's Austin, and now I've got to the hilarious examples. How many minutes? I love them. They border on the surreal. Suppose an authorized official stands ready to name a ship, the Queen Elizabeth, but, Austin's phrase, a low type rushes up, grabs the bottle, smashes it against the prow, crying, "I hereby name this ship the Generalissimo Stalin." Now, I'm going to quote Austin. We can agree it was an infernal shame. I hope you get the color of that phrase. Not many people would use that phrase nowadays. We can agree it was an infernal shame, says Austen. And we can agree that it did not count as naming the ship, because it was the low type. It was the low type who grabbed their champagne bottle. So here's another one. Suppose someone tries to marry. They say, I do, but it doesn't count because the prospective spouse is a monkey. In other versions of it, the celebrant is a monkey. Anyway, these are just sort of by the way. And here's one that is not in How to Do Things with Words. I found it somewhere else. It's still one of my favorites. Suppose a short-sighted saint sprinkles water on the inhabitants of a remote island. They say, I baptize you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. Of course, my religious upbringing is coming in my enthusiasm for this example. I baptize you in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. And it doesn't count as a baptism because they are penguins. Okay, so this is Austen's interpretation of a story by Anatole France called Penguin Island, which has been mistranslated. A scholarly footnote to Richard Holton, who knows French much better than me, and pointed out that actually they were great orcs. Never mind. Okay, it is a very... Anyway, never mind. Penguin. Sie sind nicht penguins, sie sind great orcs. Okay, all right. In each case, there's a misfire or nullity because the felicity conditions are not fulfilled. The want of authority for the naming, the want of a suitable spouse for the marriage, maybe the want of a soul for the baptism, not quite clear, the want of an adequate capacity or minimum personal qualification for the will, that's what Hart says, or we might say, for want of rules specifying procedures and conditions that would empower a low type to name a ship, or a monkey to be married, or a penguin to be baptized, or an incapacitated person to make a will. In other words, there's a connection between the system of felicity conditions and the empowering rules that basically set up the system of felicity conditions, the conditions for the success of these speech acts. So I think Hart is right to say that this is one of the wonderful contributions of the law to social life. He says one of the great contributions of the law to social life, namely contributing to the empowerment of individuals to mold our legal relations with each other. But now for the dark cloud behind this silver lining, the empowering role is one of its most grotesque and oppressive contributions to social life. Also, we mold our legal relationship with others for ill and not for good when it comes to property, employment, contract, marriage, yielding familiar patterns of exploitation and inequity. The social world we build through the exercise of these powers includes just and unjust relationships of obligation and intimacy, and the rules that empower by that token disempower. To switch from Austen's surreal examples to some salient ones, someone who tries to marry and says, I do, but it does not count, not because the prospective spouse is a monkey, but because this prospective spouse is of the same sex. That too would be a misfire. Or suppose someone tries to vote, but it doesn't count because the speaker is black in apartheid South Africa. Or someone tries to refuse sex and they say no, but it doesn't count because she is a wife and he is her husband. And now I'm going to quote from Sir Matthew Hale, writing in 1736, and the wife hath in marriage given up herself in this kind unto her husband, which she cannot retract. In other words, there is no such thing as marital rape because all marital rape is deemed all marital sex is deemed consensual. That principle was reaffirmed, by the way, as recently in British law in 1984 and overturned only in 1991. And I looked it up online, about 1/3 of UN member states still have a law like that on the books. Okay. In each case, the Speech Act faces a problem, not because what is said is banned or penalized, but because its felicity conditions have not been fulfilled. The speaker does not have the power or cannot exercise that power because something has got in the way. She says her words, but she's silenced in her speech act. That's what I've elsewhere called illocutionary disablement. Let me emphasize this. Nullity is not the same as a directive, which resembles an order backed by a threat. Being unable to speak is different to being punished if you speak. That's the basic difference. There's more to say about that, but I'll leave it at that on that topic. because, let's see how many, I've got 5. I've got 5 minutes, okay. I have some examples. Okay, I have some examples, and I will give you a little bit of detail on one of them, and I hope you'll see how the other ones would work. The example that I want to begin with is from feminist work on the very highly contested topic of pornography. One of the things that certain feminist theorists have argued about pornography is that pornography is like the law for women. Now, that is a very radical thesis. I'm not going to defend it here. But here are some examples of that thought. They are quotations 5 and 4 on the handout. Andrea Dworkin in Heartbreak writes, "Pornography is the Bible of sexual abuse. It is chapter and verse. Pornography is the law on what you do to a woman when you want to have mean fun on her body and she's no one at all." So she is claiming that pornography is effectively the law for women because it is setting up certain sorts of social norms that tell people how to treat women. In my interpretation, in this passage, she is treating pornography as a source of directive rules. Treat women this way. By contrast, in the passage that I'm going to quote now, McKinnon, I believe, is treating pornography as a source of something like empowering rules that at the same time disempower. She says, "The free speech of men silences the free speech of women. It is the same social goal, just other people." And she says, it's actually in a slightly different passage, I don't want to mislead you, together with its material supports, authoritatively saying someone is inferior is largely how structures of status and differential treatment are demarcated and actualized. Words and images are how people are placed in hierarchies. Social stratification is made to seem inevitable and right. Feelings of inferiority and superiority are engendered, and indifference to violence against those on the bottom is rationalized and normalized. Now, I'm interested in that partly from a Speech Act theoretic point of view. You know, if I had time, I'd go through sort of which bits of these are the illocutionary Speech Act, which are the effects, the downstream effects. But what I mainly want to say in this context is she is saying that pornography is setting up the space for it's setting up the role for what women have to live in, and pornography is like the law in a different sense, yet partly as a source of directives, but also as a system of constitutive rules, as we might say, of empowering rules, which at the same token disempower because they make women count as second-class citizens. A very natural comparison when you think of authoritatively saying someone is inferior is how structures of status are actualized. An apartheid law would do exactly that. And an apartheid law sets up a system of rules which empowers some people, for instance, to vote, and disempowers others, for instance, to vote. So I hope you can see that I am skating over this very fast, but I hope you see there are two implicit ways of thinking about rules even in this. And in the longer version of this paper, I want to apply that to 2 other ideas. One of them is about the silencing in the political context of the media, of journalism, especially by speech acts of the kind that Trump, for instance, indulges in when he constantly drip, 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 fake news press, fake news press, fake news press, over and over again. What is that doing? It is setting up a system whereby the role that the media had beforehand is suddenly a role that is counted as inferior and has less authority than it had before, and now the authority we're thinking of is less epistemic authority. That's been one of the ongoing effects. The second example I want to think about is hate speech, and how hate speech involves both of these kinds of rules. It involves directive rules, treat people of that kind this way. It also involves empowering rules, which at the same time disempower people of that kind are such and such, and they count as such and such. These are constitutive rules that bring it about that people have of certain kinds have an inferior civil standing in exactly the way that McKinnon describes. So I am running out of time. If I had more time, I would go through the UN, the United Nations Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, which is about hate speech, and how many nations, including yours and mine, both of mine, have signed up to this and ratified it. And I would go through and talk about what kinds of things are being thought to be done through hate speech as a speech act and what they contribute to the system of social norms in these two different ways. I'm running out of time. I'm going to conclude, and my conclusion is going to be about reimagining the ideal as the protection through directive rules and enablement through empowering rules of speech acts doing things with words that matter given their normative significance. And I haven't said anything hardly about the what matters. And here, of course, we need to draw on the wealth of work on free speech. Why do certain speech acts matter? And we've heard lots of stories about that, lots of accounts of this. There's knowledge, there's mental well-being, there's Michael John on self-government and political participation, there's Schifrin on a thinker-based approach. There are many, many different accounts. The point is, we need to there's no dodging the question what matters. That's all I want to say about that. I also want to draw on, I want to return to Mill for just two more things, and then I will shut up. Mill said that not on liberty, but in a lecture, actually, he's one of many people to whom this is attributed. What it takes for evil to succeed is for others to look on and do nothing. I'm interested in drawing on that idea in Mill to show how we can use this picture to think differently about counter-speech as well. Because what is counter-speech? Counter-speech is precisely when evil speech is there. By evil speech, I mean evil in the sense that Brandeis used. There's a quotation on the handout for that too, at least yes, there is, quotation number 8. I'll let you read it on your own. Confronted with this, if others look on and do nothing, the evil speech gains its force, and the social norms will develop in a particular, much more harmful way. And so this brings with it not only rights to free speech, it brings also responsibilities for creating the empowering rules that make the space that enable us to speak in the first place. Thank you.
To RAE Langton. This is your seat, and please welcome Christoph Möllers.
I'm in the middle. You should sit in the middle.
No, this is exactly the right angle for the camera. Right, just one very basic, not really a question, but just to get this idea very clear for everyone. Who's maybe not too familiar with speech act theory, the way speech is limited or restricted by these rules that you were talking about is not in the way that people cannot utter sounds anymore, right? But they cannot do certain things with their words, right? That's the basic idea you were putting forward, right?
That's exactly right. So, so to think through again some of the examples that I mentioned. When your speech misfires, you have your words, but you can't perform your speech act with your words. Mm. So Austen's low type can't name the ship. And a woman under British, old British marital rape law can't refuse sex. It's literally impossible. And the thought was that this idea of the capacities to speak generally extends to many, many other kinds of speech acts where it's social norms that support, social norms of a constitutive kind that support our powers. Yeah.
Right. So she can say no, right? But it doesn't constitute a refusal to have sex. That's the idea, right? Okay. Yeah, thanks so much.
Yes, thank you for your talk too. Wonderful. I've really to apologize for my first question because it's in a way very parochial and in another way very too general. But I was thinking when you gave your account of you know, these two kinds of rules and the intertwinement of them and the empowering possibilities they have, not necessarily so, but have, isn't that somehow a very, in a way, demanding construction in which you somehow try to leave the iron cage of normative individualism? So basically, you know, you see Hart's critique of Rawls, you know, ignoring in a way the pain that is inflicted of people through individual liberty. He referring to material security as one effect. Doesn't that all you're saying here somehow cry for a more comprehensive idea of a political community? And for, in a way, an idea of social freedom that encompasses both social and legal rules, as well as negative and positive ideas of freedom. So we're sitting here in Berlin, we're sitting basically in Hegel's university, and I was thinking you are somehow starting with, off with a very, in a way, classical liberal, methodologically individualist account, but you end up with something that Anglo-Americans call communitarianist, and Germans might think of other authors in that context. So you see what I mean? Yeah. So obviously, an author like Hart, when he somehow invents the idea of empowering rules, he invents in a way the idea of a constitution, which he doesn't invent as a wholesome idea of a community empowering its members to do stuff, to be free.
Yeah. So personally, I think what I've said is compatible with an individualistic picture of free speech that liberals ought to accept. Whether they do accept it would be we can look into that. But I guess the point is that if you care about speech, speech is not simply about making noises. Speech is about doing things with words, and then you need to think, well, what are the conditions for doing things with words? As one of our speakers earlier today said, when you're on Robinson Crusoe's island, you haven't got free speech. Free speech does involve a wider context. It does involve a wider community. And so what I've been wanting to do is sort of spell out some of the greater conditions for it. But I haven't said anything about, you know, what kind of, how that responsibility for these other rules ought to be grounded. I mean, this is, you know, with my Kantian hat on, there are various options. You know, you might think there are imperfect duties to promote certain ways of communicating. Or perhaps there are perfect duties never to lie, because lying and bullshitting are undermining the process. I haven't. So this is a sort of missing part of the paper, but. It's compatible with that. The law's role is to do some of the protection part, but it would be pointless. The law needs social norms as well. I mean, so to take the case, I mean, this is obvious when it comes to the examples of speech acts like promise and consent, that these are both ordinary, socially constructed, socially enabled, I should say, speech acts, which then get particular legal meaning over the top of them. So anyway, here I'm with Jeremy Waldron about the need for social norms to be in place to shore up what the law needs.
But when the reference to social norms is, in a way, I think very satisfying, but in the way very dissatisfying in that you cannot recreate social norms. You cannot really, oh, can you? So they seem to be somehow elusive to a political process, to this kind of form where you can somehow connect to laws. Yeah. So they seem to be very much about a practice that then is somehow a community product that no one really can arrange or produce. And then I'm wondering, so what you are aiming at when you talk about social norms?
So no one person can do it. But to go back to Hart's football analogy. So I think the story I'm about to tell is true, but it might be apocryphal. Hart's example of football is relevant to this story because supposedly rugby was invented the following way. Everyone was playing football at rugby, the school, and then somebody picked up and ran with the ball, and instead of violating the rule of football, they were thereby instigating the new rules for rugby. I mean, there's a Wikipedia entry on this, which I have no idea how scholarly it is. But you're right that no one person can do it. But it's also true that each person is responsible for contributing to the social norms and the social fabric in which we live. So to that extent, it's definitely going beyond an atomistic picture.
But at the end of the day, when we think of this idea, so we have norms that somehow empower us, and these norms are not necessarily legal norms, but social norms, and we want to end up in a community in which somehow everyone feels empowered to free speech and is not silenced. Doesn't that lead us at the end to something else than norms? I'm wondering about that. So it's not the end point of your own argument, something that is somehow working beyond this claim for authority that somehow is connected to the normative?
So there are, first of all, it's not about whether you feel empowered, it's whether you are empowered.
Yes.
Okay, so it's a completely objective picture.
Yeah.
It's a completely objective picture, but compatibly with that, social norms can be created by our practices, and it's compatible with, I don't know, pictures of social norms where regularities get established, often just by one first step, like the picking up of the ball for the first time. And then others take it up. And then if you think, I mean, there are many different accounts of social norms, but if a social norm is let's say a regularity that is maintained in place partly by the expectation that it will be fulfilled, partly by patterns of approval and disapproval. I haven't got anything very original to say about social norms as such. They are things that we can find out. They are things that we can create, and they are also things that are really there and really change. So okay.
No. You had this example with Trump, for instance, and one way to think of the maneuver that he's pursuing, or populists in general maybe pursuing, is that they consistently undermine certain norms of truthfulness, right, in social discourse or public discourse, and thereby erode these very norms. And that seems to be something they do as a political strategy, really, right?
Well, absolutely. And in fact, I read an article yesterday which quoted Trump in an interview saying exactly that. So a Republican interviewer was saying, look, we're a bit tired of all of this fake news press all the time. It's getting a bit monotonous. And he says, oh, I'm doing it for a reason. The more I say it, the less the media will be believed. I think, yes, so what you have is the effect of sort of one person doing the equivalent of picking up the ball and making it into a new regularity that is then seen as the norm, and creating and also, you know, getting back to Hart's words, destroying something that should be a social good, that is also a collective social good.
I was wondering when philosophers talk about that and about, you know, the crisis of truthful politics and so on and so forth, and then attributing, and that is obviously a major theme of our conference too, and then they attribute it to, you know, basically evil persons like Johnson or Trump, which are obviously some kind of condition for that, but not necessarily, you know, they're not sufficient, they're only a necessary condition. So that wouldn't work if there is not something ready to accept that. And then I look at the history of philosophy, and I was thinking, you know, there's so much going on in the 20th century, the collapse of the fact-value distinction, pragmatism somehow promoting that you basically cannot really tell the normative from the descriptive, critical theory, and so on and so forth. So I was always wondering that the subversion of this idea of, truth for politics, isn't that very much a product of 20th century theory? Isn't that your responsibility, if I may address both of you?
I'm just the moderator.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay, so let me just say, although I did perhaps rashly use the word evil, I'm very happy to retract it. I mean, I used evil because I wanted to mention Brandeis, who was talking about evil speech. I certainly don't think it's just a matter of sort of malevolent or even Machiavellian speakers. And in fact, purely mechanical, profit-oriented speech might be just as much responsible for undermining of the sort of social framework that I'm talking about. I don't know whether it's worse or not. From where I'm standing, I don't recognize this picture.
Okay.
So perhaps because I'm still a table-thumping moral realist. But you don't have to be a table-thumping moral realist to believe any of the things I just said. You can be, because what I'm talking about is actually social construction and how social construction gets in the way of things that many people would value whether or not they are moral realists.
But yeah, I mean, what you're basically committed to, as far as I can see, is that, well, norms are socially constructed in the sense that they come into reality by, let's break it down to this, mutual expectations, for instance, or something along those lines. Probably there's more to the picture, but the very basic idea, I think, can be spelled out via expectations, right? I have certain expectations towards others, and they know that I have these expectations, and the other way around, and that way certain norms come into being. But the reason that they're socially constructed in this way doesn't mean that they're not real, right? I mean, money is real, and it has value, and it's certainly a social construction. And you're not committed to anything more than that, right?
No.
So that's exactly what I mean. So yes, exactly. Social norms are real in exactly the way that money is real. And you want to have an idea about social norms creating certain oughts and permissions, which are real but local oughts and permissions, and real but local authority structures. And here I think the analogy with the law is perfect. Because the law gives us a fantastic example of systems of obligations and permissions and systems and structures of authority, which from some wider standpoint we may want to criticize. So an apartheid law or a slave law, it's creating genuine obligations and permissions, and it's constructing genuine local hierarchies, which from an outside point of view, you want to say those shouldn't be there. So all of that is just as real as money is real. Yeah.
Perhaps my last point. I mean, we have all read Austin. We have all somehow become performativists in a certain way. So we know about the relation between doing and saying. But isn't there also a flip side or a backside to that? That in a way, from a descriptive as well as from a normative point of view, it's always somehow interesting to distinguish saying from doing, or to say saying is a very specific kind of doing, and one nice thing about saying might be that it doesn't really create so much causal effects, or to saying that it is somehow doesn't have too many implications. So isn't that one interesting thing about the theory of free speech and opinion, that you can say it's somehow in the twilight between belief and causation, that you say something and then it might happen something, it might not, and that this specificity is a little bit getting lost when we identify doing and saying that, and in the kind of way Austin has somehow invented or promoted, and that we are all somehow obviously owe a lot to.
I find quite paradoxical, the different things people say about language and speech. On the one hand, there's the thought you just expressed by saying that they're not really doing very much, not compared to our other actions, say. And on the other hand, I mean, so there's the picture of speech as that's captured in the, you know, sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. I presume there's a German equivalent to this proverb as well.
Brilliant.
And so that's the picture of speech as inert. But at the same time, there's the picture of speech as so important and so valuable and so such a major thing that it deserves all of this. So on the one hand, it's you have the people who think, oh, it needs to be protected in a very special way because it's not really doing anything, and so we don't need to worry about it. And it's just, you know, no more harmful than breathing or something, which of course we know can be harmful after COVID, but never mind. But sorry, make your own example up. Or then you have the other one that says, no, the speech is it's the expression of your it's the expression of your thought, and because it's the expression of your very self, it's the expression of your autonomy, and it has all of this very important stuff, and I don't think either of those are right, because saying is doing in a sort of rather different way. Speech is when we perform speech acts, we're very often not expressing what we ourselves are choosing to do. Sometimes we are, and sometimes we need to be in order to perform the speech act. So sexual consent is an example where the intention to do it is absolutely necessary. But in other cases, you can end up performing speech acts by mistake, I think. So that you didn't intend to perform at all. And they can be very powerful, not in the sense of having causal effects, but in terms of enacting normative structures with every single thing we do, with it, through our saying.
Still, I'm wondering about just the experimentalist, you know, element of a debate, that somehow you play around with arguments, there is no real implication of it, you say something in order to see what the reaction will be, you cannot anticipate it, and sometimes it seems to me that our whole debate is little bit forgetting about that kind of element, and maybe one could include that in your take to say maybe the experimentalism and this kind of open-ended and somehow open result form of debate is only possible under certain social conditions. Maybe one could say something about that, but I still think that could be part of the picture.
So I don't think there's any shortage of people talking about the deliberative and argumentative side to our speech. So I think, on the contrary, I feel like there's a very strong focus, there's so much a strong focus on the idea of speech as a conversation that we have as we're reasoning together, perhaps trying to generate a collective will, or perhaps discussing politics, to the extent that the other forms of speech act that we perform are invisible. So often people bring in speech acts, for instance, in the case of hate speech. I agree with Jeremy Waldron when he says that much hate speech basically is a speech act saying, get out. That's what kind of speech act it's performing. It's saying, get out of here, we don't want your kind here. And it's saying that even when it has the official form of a contribution to a debate. And unless you're looking at the illocutionary force of the speech act, and if you're getting distracted by the vision of speech as this. Of course, it's an ideal. That what you described is a certain kind of ideal of speech, which I love. But when you assume that we have already reached it, you make it more remote.
Yeah, I agree with that. I was probably not even thinking of rational deliberation as, you know, a truth functional thing, but rather of a conversation that somehow plays around and is somehow not even aiming at something more than itself, in order to socialize people. But maybe that is just a romantic idea that...
I see. Do you think I'm against small talk?
No, I don't think you're against anything. No, I was just wondering about that effect.
But to challenge your view a little bit more, wouldn't you say, I mean, there's this harm principle, right, in Mill, where the idea is that, well, yeah, you can do whatever you like as long as you don't harm anyone. And some people would think that the harm principle somehow also restricts freedom of speech, right? That you can do whatever you want in the realm of speaking, as long as you don't physically harm anyone, right? But then, if your view is correct, which I guess it is, I mean, speech act, that there are such things as speech acts is not that controversial in and of itself, then it becomes really intricate, right, to spell out a free speech principle that does not immediately crash against the walls of the harm principle, right? Because you cannot then say, well, it's all about physical harm, because that just seems arbitrary suddenly, right? If you take seriously the idea that there are other harms that are done by silencing, for instance. And so now I'm really just trying to be sharp, and I mean edgy. Is this not illiberal?
Okay. Both sharp and edgy, I would say. Okay. First of all, the question that you asked is a question that applies not just to me, but to every single political system ever. So, you know, even in the US First Amendment situation, there are many, many Speech Act types that are not permitted. And I'm not just thinking shouting fire in a crowded theater. I'm not a First Amendment expert, but, you know, there's, funnily enough, one of Austin's main examples of a speech act was shoot her. So the example of shoot her as an utterance which has a certain illocutionary force of an order, and he used that example to explain the difference between the illocutionary force of an order and as against the semantic, or what he called locutionary content, shoot with a gun as opposed to with a camera, and her referring to the woman nearby, and then it has certain effects. Anyway, so utterances like shoot her are not going to be protected because of the kind of speech act they are. Then there's a whole range of other utterances that involve, I don't know, insider trading, and there are lots, or I'm no expert on this, but I have read articles which set out, I don't know, about 20 different kinds of speech act that are not protected because of the kind of things they are doing with words. And so whatever the problem is, it's not a problem that is unique to this, but what's absolutely right in your sharp and edgy question is that I haven't said nearly enough about the kinds of speech acts that a free speech principle ought to be occupying itself with, as opposed to speech acts much more generally. How do we work them out? And the reason I haven't done that is that it's going to actually depend on your normative theory of free speech, which ones are going to count.
I think we have set the stage sufficiently for you to join us in this discussion. And there are 2 microphones in the room, and please wait until the microphone has reached the vicinity of your mouth. Please.
Vicinity.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Could you, if you don't mind, get up so that people can see you?
Yeah, why not? Okay. I'm sort of reminded a little bit of a conference in Paris in 2022, Les Armes de la Désinformation, the weapons of disinformation, because everything you've been talking about sort of considers a certain hierarchy in society, a certain standing. You know, when you take examples of the past, there's a social structure, a higher official versus a lower person. The problem we have nowadays is these structures are breaking down, and they're breaking down in many places. So take journalism. We have respected newspapers that publish rubbish. We have journalists who have started independent blogs who write very high quality articles. So this picture has become very diffuse. And then obviously if we go back to the weapons of disinformation, one of the points mentioned at conference was it takes a lot more effort to refute an incorrect information than to publish something that is correct. And then obviously nowadays we've lost the boundaries of who can publish stuff. So anybody can publish anything, which is already a problem. And now we also have people who try to weaponize it. And then the question is, does this theory nowadays still work? Because it's written for a different society.
That's a very interesting question. I don't think I'm only speaking about disinformation, because part of what we want to do is think not only about whether falsities are being propagated, but also whether social norms of various kinds are being altered, including the devaluation of certain people and so forth. So I'm not only interested in disinformation, but I really like your question for a number of reasons. One is that it's pinpointing the issue of authority and how complex it is to work out what the structures of authority are. It's also inviting us to think harder about the difference between practical authority, which is involved in telling someone what to do, and epistemic authority, which is what the journalists hopefully have, where you are an authority, what Raz called a theoretical authority, where what's being offered are grounds for belief. And then there's an intimate connection between these two, because sometimes posing as a certain kind of epistemic authority, even just along the way, can help help you be a practical authority. In fact, that's in Raz himself says, you know, that a quack. Sorry, he's not talking about quack doctors. I talk about quack doctors. That they're fake doctors. A doctor prescribes for you. So that's conveying the idea of a directive of a certain kind. And the doctor prescribes for you. Why? Because the doctor has a certain epistemic authority over the state of your health. And so there can be an intimate connection between claims of epistemic authority and claims of practical authority. And then there's a whole other part of the picture where, you know, where do sources get their authority? And that's another project I'm very interested in, because yes, in the absence of these official structures, very many speakers get their authority on the fly through a process that the philosophers of language call accommodation. That's to say, they presuppose their authority, and when the hearers let them get away with it, they get what they presuppose. And that is that's why I'm so interested in the linguistic phenomenon of accommodation, because I think it's got profound political implications for the negotiation of structures of authority in informal settings, which we so much have now. Thank you.
Thank you. I made some notes, sorry. I have a rather technical question, actually. It's a conceptual question. It's basically, what is the difference with regard to social norms between the disempowering aspect of empowering norms and a directive rule? It's very clear in legal theory. It's helpful because we can say, okay, you have a directive rule. If you breach it, you get a fine. You get punished.
Yeah.
If you have an empowering rule and you don't fulfill the conditions of the empowering rule, you don't get punished. You just simply don't create what you wanted to create.
Yeah.
Well, if you think further, it's maybe not that clear, because imagine you think you're married and then your husband dies. And then it turns out you've never been married.
Yeah.
Then you could say, well, you're punished because you don't inherit anything.
Yeah.
And if you now confer this to even social norms, I'm really wondering, is there any difference with regard to the consequences that we can still make. And if that isn't the case, we have to rethink about the disempowering aspect. Don't we have to include this in directive rule? And don't we have to think about the relation and not just say there's a distinction between directive rules and empowering rules, because I think they're intimately connected by this negation. Thank you.
Thank you. This is a really interesting question, and I also like it because legal theorists apparently brought it against Hart himself, so I feel in good company. But the difference between being punished for stealing and not being able to perform a speech act of a particular kind I'm not sure if this is the best example, but there's someone who, let's say in apartheid South Africa, is not being punished for voting. It's rather that they are not able to vote, literally. It's not that they they vote and then they get punished for voting. It's that they literally cannot perform that speech act if they are the wrong sort of person. And it's that structural difference, the idea that certain rules are directive and have this structure that sets up an obligation that is backed up by a sanction, that has a different structure to the kind of rule that sets up, if you like, constitutive rules that create the space for action. There's also something I want to agree with in what you say, however, which is that the disempowering aspect of empowering rules can act like a punishment in the following way. If you know that your words are not going to be count as the speech act of a certain kind, you will have no incentive even to say the words. So it'll be disincentivized in the same way, to the same extent that you might be put off stealing because you're going to be punished. Not going to the polling booth because what you say won't count as a vote. You won't do that, and that disincentive is a parallel to the disincentive that you have when you won't do something because you think you'll be punished by it. But I still believe that structurally these are very different, and that structurally there's in some ways something more profound about the impossibility of performing an action as opposed to being punished for performing that action.
Thank you. Thanks for your talk. I wanted to ask about the relation between the rules and the felicity conditions. So it strikes me like a lot of felicity, particularly hero uptake, is more related to convention rather than these types of directive or empowering rules. So I'm thinking, many women in philosophy have experienced this. They're in a classroom, they're trying to say, well, that's not what Kant said, and no one can kind of hear them as making that complaint. And I don't think it has anything, I don't feel it's captured very well by these two types of rules. I think it's captured more by the idea that it's just conventionally more, it's more of a, convention that just men say the relevant things in philosophy just because they're the overwhelming majority in the field. So I wondered if you have more to say, it's just an invitation to say more about how that works, or if there's something maybe special about hero uptake that I haven't considered yet. Thank you.
So yeah, in the longer version of the paper, I do want to say much more about hero uptake. And you're right that for Austin, it's a very important part of the picture. What I'm working with is the idea that what Austin called convention is a system of rules that that specify what the felicity conditions are for certain kinds of speech acts. And in the case of marriage, it's extremely ceremonial. Whether it involves uptake or not in the case of marriage, I think it probably does. It certainly involves certain responses from hearers. In the case of, speak now or forever hold your peace. That's an item in our marriage formula. And I'm thinking of the more informal social constitutive norms, which is the parallel to Osternon Convention, as specifying a variety of different felicity conditions. And we can work out what they are by seeing what's happening on the ground. We can work out what they are. So in your example, which is a fantastic example, the social practice is one where, just like in the case of apartheid law, it turns out that certain people do not meet the conditions for being able to perform a speech act of this kind. In the case of apartheid law, the speech act in question is voting. In the case that you're talking about, it's that a speaker of this kind does not have the authority. And here it might be helpful to, I don't know if it's helpful or not. I want to draw also on what Miranda Fricker writes about epistemic injustice. That, I mean, it's not quite the same as what she calls testimonial injustice, but it does involve a kind of unjust distribution of credibility, which is an unjust distribution of authority. For me, the issue that you described is both an issue of failure of uptake, but the failure of uptake is explained by the unjust distribution of authority, which is in turn explained by the background social norm, which says people of this kind count as such and such, and people of this kind count as such and such. So there are background issues of hierarchy and of social ontology and of ranking, which then explain the subsequent patterns of uptake. So that's how I see them as fitting together. But it's a great question. Thank you.
Hier vorne, bitte.
Yeah, also thank you very much. I was also wondering about this question of social change inside your theoretical model, because at the beginning of the presentation you talked about, kind of use this term of bullshit communication that can also be, a danger to, this sort of normative ideal you put out. And then afterwards, in a discussion, you talked about this example that Austin gave of the invention of rugby and how it started out as a very non-serious practice of, if you could say so, a kind of bullshit, if you want to say so. Don't we also need this kind of, when we want to talk about like performative change, change to speech acts, don't we also need this kind of more kind of strategic relationship to, bullshit in a sense?
Okay, so interesting. The analogy I was wanting to make with the rugby maneuver was really with a way of thinking about, and I didn't get a chance to go into this properly, how to respond to harmful speech through counter speech as opposed to through the law. And it's a bigger question what our responsibilities are for counter speech. So at the very least, two forms of action seem to be relevant to social change from what I was saying. At the level of the individual contributing or not contributing to social norms, as the case may be. One of them is about not lying and not bullshitting, because that involves damaging the background social fabric that maybe helps create the powers. I didn't go into that in much detail. That's a kind of Kantian thought. The other is about not simply refraining from the things that damage the fabric that enables speech, but actively blocking the evil speaker from the authority that they are presupposing. And here I'm drawing on the paper that is about the possibility of blocking as a form of counter-speech. And by blocking, I mean, so blocking is discussed in philosophy of language as a kind of questioning of the speaker of what they are presupposing. So if I say even George could win, and you say, what do you mean even George? What's wrong with George? So we have the blocking of a presupposition. If you think that presuppositions of speech acts are also presuppositions, then we have the same thing going on with the felicity conditions for authoritative speech. So someone starts telling people what to do. Who do you think you are telling us what to do? That is also a kind of blocking or questioning, which in this case is not a form of argument, and that's what I wish I had time to talk about. It's a kind of counter-speech which is not saying, okay, the harmful speaker is saying P, I therefore will say not P. It's saying, harmful speaker is saying P, and then you are satirizing the harmful speaker, or you're doing something that is undermining their authority rather than contradicting the content of what they're saying. Anyway, so that's another different topic. There may well be the space for many other forms of resistance or scope for positive social change. I haven't even begun to look at them all. In fact, I hardly looked at any of them in this talk. Sorry.
Einmal hier hinten, bitte.
Yeah, thank you very much for your talk. I also found it really interesting. I also wanted to push a bit on the question regarding empowering norms, and especially this kind of relation you hinted at between empowerment and disempowerment. In your handout, it's on point 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's like the 6th sentence where you say rules empowering some can disempower others, and then you go on the examples of voting, marriage, refusal, and so forth. That's one. And I guess I wanted to ask how strong the thesis is, because here you're saying it can happen, like rules empowering can also disempower, but with the example you gave, for example, with football, by saying that the rule that defines that a goal has to be within like the arc or whatever, necessarily implies that everything that doesn't go in there isn't, and then you have this idea of a more internal connection between empowerment and disempowerment. So empowering rules or norms have to disempower others, or even like the same person but in different circumstances. So I wanted to like push a bit on this question, because on the one hand, I mean, you could say it is conceptually trivial, because like the football players, they are disempowered when they don't score, and they are empowered when they score. But at the same time, you could say it's practically meaningful, because like for voting rights, having like racist rules that kind of disempower people, it's problematic. But if you ask yourself, like, I mean, should children have a right to vote, and so forth and so on, and you begin like to expand it, then you see like there's like this kind of practical meaningfulness of disempowerment. And I was also like, this is a bit speculative, but with the football example, I was thinking if there's a kind of asymmetry. So you have to disempower a bit more that you empower for certain practices to function, So that was my question.
Yeah, so we can't have it that nearly every time you kick the ball, it's a goal. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, good. That's a great question. Here's something I completely agree with in what you were saying. Although I don't agree with the description, isn't disempowerment therefore trivial? But I do agree that I didn't say enough about when it is trivial and when it isn't. Sometimes when you talk about disempowerment, it comes across in a normatively loaded way, such that, oh, it's a terrible tragedy if you're disempowered. But of course, it's not a tragedy if I kicked the ball and it didn't go in the goalposts. And this is related to I'm not disempowered or the child is not. okay, the child is, in this sense, disempowered if they can't vote, but it's good to have a system in which a 5-year-old can't vote. Okay. So in that sense, there's a, in that sense, certain sorts of disempowerment are good. And by the way, I hope you noticed, when I was reimagining counter-speech, I was saying, yeah, let's try and disempower the evil speech. So that's the kind of disempowerment that I was recommending, because I thought it was good. I thought it would be good. So I didn't say enough about the circumstances in which disempowerment is good and circumstances in which it's bad, and circumstances in which it's completely neutral and perhaps trivial, as you say. Nevertheless, whether you think it's good or bad, certain kinds are good for the kinds of reasons that Hart said, and I was just wanting to spell out the dark side of some of them. And the voting case helps spell that out. One thing else, just as a quick note on what you said, you might think also that the fact that certain powers are easy to make doesn't, sorry. I didn't say enough about the communicative powers and what enables them. I said they depend on social practices to which we all contribute. But some people might think that that power that we have is so easy to have that everybody has it. And so there's no opportunity for disempowerment. So for instance, telling people things. Anybody can do that. Why do you think this needs any practice, social practice? Telling people things. This is so basic. We don't need anything like the system of practices that we need for promising. I think we do, but I haven't said enough about it. And the reason I think we do is partly picked up by the previous question about how, you know, telling people things doesn't always work. Why not? Because actually, telling people things requires, contrary to what many people say, a certain minimal kind of epistemic standing where you are the kind of person who can make this speech act in this situation, and if you're not good enough in the hierarchy, you won't be able to make it. So I believe even telling people things requires a minimal amount of authority. Maybe, and again, there's the complication that you can get it on the fly, as I mentioned before, through accommodation. But yeah, great question, thanks.
I have 2 more people on the list, and I want to hear those, but I won't take any more questions. Please.
Thank you so much. This has been fascinating. I worry that you've already started to answer the question I was going to ask when you started talking about blocking, but it seems really important. So I think I just want to invite you to say even more about counterspeech and how you envision it. Maybe to turn this into a bit of a question. I toy with the thought that we should make fun a lot more of people that do evil speech, kind of just make them seem like they're losers, because they often are, as a way to disempower them. Is that the kind of thing you might also have in mind? Do you have other ideas for the kinds of counterspeech that we could engage in as a society to do this?
Yeah. So this is, so building on, so there's very nice work back in the early 90s by the linguist and philosopher of language Marina Spizar, who some of you might recognize if you know your Austin, as the editor, along with Urmson, of the later edition of Austin, How to Do Things with Words. She's a fantastic philosopher and linguist. And in the paper I'm thinking of, which is on presupposition and ideology, she recommends, where have you gone? Who just asked this question?
Here.
Here.
Sorry, I'm looking at the wrong person. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. She recommends what she calls explicitation as the spelling out of presuppositions. This is in a paper where she called Presupposition and Ideology, where she examines Italian newspapers and examines what we might call the subtexts of all of the articles and the presupposition triggers that are being used, you know, the election in the Po Valley, the scare quotes election in the Po Valley, this kind of thing. What's being shunted by you? And she says we can teach people more readily to identify presupposition triggers to see how they're being manipulated. She thinks this is a great form of great skill to have. And in the philosophy of language terms, this involves, so blocking, one way to block is to explicitate, in her terminology. That is to say, you spell it out. So even George could win. What do you mean, even George? Or This doesn't always work. I had an experience which I've recounted elsewhere, also to do with football, interestingly. I don't know anything about football, but in Australia, when I had my first job, I needed to get acculturated into Australian football culture, and I was taken along to a game about which I knew very little, and below us, I should say, because I went with some friends, in the stadium was a very noisy fan of the St Kilda team who was very angry with one of the teammates he was supporting, and he said, "Get on with it, Laurie, you great girl." Okay, so in terms that we know from our workshop, he's using girl as a slur term for the player who was not running strongly and forcefully enough, or was behaving too girlishly, whatever, for whatever reason. And my companion decided he would intervene and said, "What's wrong with a girl?" This is we're just in the stand. And quick as a flash, it was hilarious. I laugh when I still think about it. The fan whirled round and said, "It's got no balls, that's what's wrong with it." So, okay, so what's wrong with, get on with it, you girl. What's wrong with a girl? It's got no balls, that's what's wrong with it. So classic case of slur term being used, presupposition being explicitated, and it completely failing because of the handy double meaning of balls in the English language, probably in many other languages. Yeah, explicitation doesn't always work, but it's something that one can do. To take another example that I love, so I was talking, I'll just give can I give 2 more examples?
Of course,
okay.
They're funny.
All right, okay. They're not all funny. Okay. So there was a time when, say, Trump has said many many interesting things. One of them was, that's just locker room talk. I don't know if anyone can remember what he said this about. He said this about something he had said on a bus about how you can grab women. Am I going to lower the tone by saying how you could grab women? Anyway, hopefully you can remember all of this. He said, he was recorded in the Hollywood, whatever it is, as having said, when you're famous, you can do anything. You can just grab women in a certain way that I won't go into in polite company. And then later, he said, that was just locker room talk. And there was much discussion. Was that just locker room talk? After all, it was on a bus, you know. Anyway, and what I loved about the online discussion was a bunch of athletes went online and said, wait a minute, we don't talk that way in locker rooms. And another said, what sort of fucking locker rooms has Donald Trump been hanging around in? Anyway, so basically they were doing the questioning of the presupposition. What presupposition? Quite an important one, namely that there exists a social norm, which we name by the phrase locker room talk, which makes it permissible to speak about women in this way. And that was just in the background as a presupposition of what he said. And if nobody questioned that presupposition, people might have gone on saying, yeah, I don't know if that was locker room talk or not, I don't know. But someone who didn't know could learn there is such a thing as locker room talk, and when I'm in a locker room, I can talk that way. You know, it's testimony that can be blocked by this blocking maneuver. And also it's testimony which can then create a social norm. I mean, imagine there was no such norm and everybody started thinking, oh, there's this norm, there's this thing, locker room talk. I guess I can talk that way since I'm in a locker room. And anyway, so little things like that can grow into bigger things and can grow into social norms, just like the picking up of the ball and running with it. This is how social norms change. And partly through what's presupposed rather than what's argued for or asserted. Anyway, so that I thought was a nice example. But you're right that I was actually talking about a different kind of presupposition, namely the presupposition that is also a felicity condition for the Speech Act. And here I want to mention one more example, which is from a paper by Ishani Maitra, who's at Michigan, and she wrote a very nice paper on the topic, a very interesting paper on the topic of subordinating speech, and she has a very interesting example to illustrate how speech that does not seem to be authoritative can nevertheless gain authority through certain licensing maneuvers, and beginning with some examples that everyone will agree with, you know, the teacher licensing a student, etc., to I don't know, tell the other students what to do, or someone acquiring authority to decide what restaurant we are going to, etc. But one of her examples is of hate speech, and apparently she witnessed this. On a train, racist on the train says, "Fucking terrorists, we don't want your kind here, get out," or something like that. And in the situation, the bystanders are silent. So this is an example of what Mill described under the heading of standing by and doing nothing. Her thesis, which I agree with, is that the hate speech utterance, in this case quite assaultive rather than propaganda-like, there are different kinds of hate speech, it acquires a kind of illocutionary force of subordination, and it acquires more authority that enables it to do that precisely due to the omissions, the silences of the bystanders. So in that case, the person who wants to block the maneuver has to do something. But what is the question? You know, after she published that paper, not long after, in Portland, there was a case where this thing happened again, and two men didn't just sort of politely get up and say, "Wait a minute, I don't know who you mean by we, because I don't agree with what you're saying." They actually, they rather forcefully intervened, and they were attacked. I believe at least one of them was killed by the racist on the train. So it shows that it can be very dangerous to perform the blocking maneuver in certain conditions. And to this, I want to say, you can block some presuppositions. I mean, yeah, satire might be something, but also, you know, anything to block that presupposition of the we, the collective we. We don't want your kind here. So how are you going to block that? You can block that by small social gestures of solidarity, small eye rolls, small eyebrow raisings, small going to sit next to someone and being friendly and asking what's the time. You know, anything to show that the lone hate speaker does not belong to this we that he was claiming. Anyway, so that's another example of I don't know, blocking as counter-speech in action, which I think is a very interesting one, though, of course, it has its hazards.
Last question for today.
My question also relates to what Rodrigo said. Is this dialectic you described that empowering rules can be disempowering for some speakers, not true in both directions? Also what you described right now, that I can use something what disempowers me in a re-empowering way, in turning the meaning against itself, in saying gay is used to discriminate people in a homophobic society. Yeah. But I want to be like this, I'm proud of it. And then I turn this utterance against itself, and it doesn't have this disempowering effects anymore. So I would read this, what you describe, in both directions in a way.
I completely agree that that is possible, and in fact, sort of Judith Butler and I have a little exchange about this very thing, because she is in certain ways very optimistic about the possibility of turning this speech against itself. You know, I've heard her talk about exactly the kind of case that you describe. Someone shouting a slur term for lesbians and saying, "Yes, I am," and embracing it. And I think that it is sometimes possible, and this relates to all kinds of interesting questions about reclamation projects quite generally. When they can be done, how they can be done, whether they are always possible. So the idea that we could reclaim slut with slut walks, for instance. I think, is this a phenomenon? Do you know about it? I mean, there was at least for a while, there were, maybe they're still happening, so-called slut walks where we're reclaiming the term slut, and I have mixed feelings about that one myself, because I am not sure it can completely be done. And whether it can be done depends on who you are. So some people can do the Judith Butler, yes, I am, but think of many people who would not be in their position and say, yes, I am. And for whom it would be very dangerous to do so. Whether you can do the reclamation depends on background factors which you as an individual are not always empowered to do. And so here again, the hierarchies will come in this extra level thing that you're quite rightly bringing in, namely the possibility of counter-speech that functions through reclamation rather than through contradicting the content or through, I think it's a really interesting and important question. Good, thanks.
Thank you so much, RAE Langton, for this talk and the discussion. Thanks, Christoph Möllers, for challenging some of the ideas, and thank all of you for this lively discussion we had in the end. RAE Langton.
Thank you.
And Christoph Möllers.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for those questions.